Yellowstone National Park was the first national park to be established in the entire United States of America, and it paved a way for the preservation of all wildlife. Yellowstone National Park is actually the 8th largest national park in the U.S., and it covers over 2.2 million acres. These 2.2 million acres span across 3 states, Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Having been to Yellowstone multiple times, and just as recent as this past summer, I know the vastness that is this national park, and I have also seen the many species of wildlife that inhabit this area. Who is an important figure in establishing Yellowstone as a national park? Why is it called Yellowstone? How has the park changed since its establishment? What types of wildlife are present in the park? These are just some of the questions I plan to answer throughout my speech and answer any of the other questions you might have. Firstly, the history of the Yellowstone is interesting and was a large part of the Reconstruction period in America. Yellowstone is not only the oldest national park in the U.S., but the oldest national park in the entire world. President Ulysses S. Grant established Yellowstone National Park on March 1st, 1872, through an act officially titled An Act to Set Apart a Certain Tract of Land Near the Headwaters of the Yellowstone River as a Public Park. This was cited from the Library of Congress in 2017. The reason the park is named Yellowstone actually comes from Native Americans who were originally referring to the yellow sandstones that lined the banks of the Yellowstone River in eastern Montana. The U.S. Army managed the park from 1886 until 1918, and Fort Yellowstone was used as the Army's headquarters, which is located near Mammoth Hot Springs, which is at the northern entrance to the Yellowstone Park. Most of the buildings are actually still around today, and they're used by the National Park Service as park headquarters, and also that's where all the employees tend to stay whenever they're working there, like during the season, either the winter or the summer. So the 1st United States Cavalry from Fort Custer, Montana territory came to Yellowstone under the command of Captain Moses Harris in order to protect and preserve the park from essentially poachers and tourists who were like up to no good and trying to illegally settle on the park. The evolution of the park from its establishment till today, the railroad arrived in Yellowstone in 1883, which allowed easier visitor access. And in 1915, automobiles were allowed into the park for the first time, making a more economical visit for tourists. The first boundary adjustment of the park was made in 1929, and today millions of people visit Yellowstone every year. In fact, in 2010, nearly 3 million people passed through its 4 entrances. So not only does Yellowstone have many visitors, the park also has many wild inhabitants. Yellowstone is home to more than 200 species of animals, from grizzly bears all the way to bald eagles. Bears are one of the Yellowstone's greatest wildlife attractions. Typically the grizzly bears are what many people hope to see whenever they visit the park, as well as black bears, and they have a population of over 500 living inside of Yellowstone. The best time to see these animals are typically in the early mornings and late evenings, and that's when I personally have seen 2 grizzly bears and at least 3 or 4 black bears. Buffalo are also a large attraction and have been in the national park long before it actually became a national park. Known as the most important bison herd in the U.S., these animals have lived continuously in Yellowstone since prehistoric times. And that was a quote from the National Park Service in 2019. A list of some of the wildlife native to the Yellowstone area. There's bears, grizzly, black, and brown. And then there's elk, moose, wolves, eagles, hawks, bisons, badgers, otters. There's fox there. There's just a ton of different variety of wildlife that live within Yellowstone. So in 1973, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually listed the northern Rocky Mountain wolf as an endangered and designated Yellowstone as one of the 3 recovery areas. And so essentially in 1995, 41 wild wolves from Canada and northwest Montana were released into Yellowstone National Park as sort of an attempt to, garner the population and reintroduce it into the wild inside of Yellowstone National Park. And as of 2015, an estimated 538 wolves resided in the Yellowstone ecosystem. This is huge because it the numbers dwindled all the way down to like the hundreds early on before the reintroduction, and so the numbers have vastly increased since then. So Yellowstone is a sanctuary to many species and ensures the long-term viability of the many species for generations to come. We have looked at the history of Yellowstone, the wildlife in the park, and more specifically, changes made to ensure the future of this amazing landmark. As many of you have probably heard of Yellowstone and all its wonders, the history, geography, and the wildlife are enough to preserve itself so that your descendants can visit. And while the area of Yellowstone has been a national park for a long 147 years, it has been a vast, ongoing ecosystem for thousands of years. Thank you for listening to my speech regarding the Yellowstone National Park.